Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by yours truly, the Package Tourist and the magical mystery tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase. Tonight's guest is author Jaime Grookett. Jaime resides in South Jersey and has been a teacher at Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey since 2021. She is also an adjunct professor at Drexel University and has been the president of the Haddonfield Board of Education since 2018. Jaime has published works at Across the Margin, Valiant Scribe, and Typehouse Literary. Her short story, Fine is for Sugar, was noted as Best of 2020 Fiction at Across the Margin. Last March, Jaime published her first novel, The Invisible Ones, which has received critical acclaim from her peers in literature and in literary journals. Tonight, we celebrate her writing career. Jaime, welcome to the show. It's an honor and privilege to have you here. I'd like to start off by asking you, Jaime, please tell our listeners about your novel, The Invisible Ones.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. The Invisible Ones takes place in 1928 rural Pennsylvania. The Children's Aid Society separates 17-year-old Anna Wilson from her three younger siblings. Anna is thrown into a foster home where she's abused by her foster brother.
Ooh.
She's illiterate, pregnant, and fears the permanent estrangement from her family. The foster family then commits her to the asylum, where she has to prove her competency before a panel of doctors. The backdrop of the story is American eugenics. She risks losing her chance to have freedom to raise her unborn child, and as well as her siblings on her farm, and in the only home she's ever known.
Wow. Now, Jaime, how long did it take you to write this novel?
It took me a little over 3 years. I had the idea stirring around in my head for a few years before I actually started writing. But once I started writing, it took about 3 years to finish a polished draft.
Okay. Now, how did you research this book?
The research was really fascinating and really was a huge part of the creation of the book. Much of it was done during COVID, so I was grateful for so many online resources. I knew a bit about asylums in Pennsylvania, so I started there. I researched Pennhurst and looked at a lot of photos from the 1920s of people who were living in asylums. I watched interviews of people who had been released from asylums. Although mostly those were men, it was very difficult for women to gain freedom. And I really couldn't find any video accounts of women talking about their experiences. But the interviews add a lot of color to the daily practice and discipline measures common in asylums, and much of that is represented in my story. Okay. My most fascinating visit was to the Vineland Historical Society in Vineland, New Jersey, where I had an opportunity to visit the existing grounds of the former Vineland Training School. At the Historical Society, they had so many historical documents to explore. I got to see menus from when the board visited the asylum in the 1920s. I actually saw what they were served. I saw what the patients ate, their daily schedules. I saw pictures of the rooms and residents, the brochures they gave to people when they were bringing their relatives there and committing them. So I really got a sense of what it felt like to live there as a patient. And in that, I also learned that the New Jersey asylum practices were much more humane than Pennsylvania. For example, the residents were called patients rather than inmates. And New Jersey did not have forced sterilization, which is a theme in my book. That was banned in New Jersey, but the practice in Pennsylvania persisted through to the 1970s.
Ouch. A question. You talked about the character comes in rural Pennsylvania. Is that the eastern part of the state, central part of the state, or the western part of Pennsylvania?
More eastern.
Okay. Let's talk about the heroine of this novel, Anna Wilson. Can you tell us about her?
So Anna is strong, but really because she's forced to be. She wants to live a very simple life, taking care of her farm and her family. Her father was an alcoholic who lived with the family, but abandoned the mother and the children before this story really takes place. Her mother struggles to cope with all the responsibility alone, and Anna's watched this closely for years. So when her mother disappears, she's left to take on all that responsibility on herself, and she struggles, but she really tries. And eventually, she does prove to be resilient, but it really isn't until she's forced to be, which I guess is similar to many of us. She's angry, and she doesn't think much of herself to start. She really sees herself as the world sees her. She sees herself as uneducated, poor, and alone, incompetent, and she eventually breaks through this and believes in herself, but it's not an easy process for her.
Yeah. Who are of course, the chief protagonist is Anna. Who are the main antagonists in this book?
So the main antagonists are really society and the practice of eugenics. On paper, the Wilsons, Anna's family, didn't look like they could ever amount to much. And so this put them in the throwaway category of society, and that's an uphill battle to fight. Anna faces privileged foster parents, privileged doctors, and she's in an asylum where no one sees her. And they never really make any effort to get to know her as a person, and instead make judgments about her that lead them to want to lock her away. And the practice of eugenics didn't leave room for self-improvement or grace when someone fell on hard times. So there was little room for error. And when labeled feeble-minded or an imbecile, you weren't seen as redeemable. And so those are, while there's a few characters that really personify the society, I think that a society as a whole is really the best antagonist.
So you get into eugenics. Okay, what led you to choose this topic? I mean, was there something that when you were doing your research that you uncovered? I mean, was this part of like a movement during the 1920s? I mean, an actual historical movement? Can you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. What really intrigued me was that I have relatives, women, I just grew up hearing stories. They were in asylums. They were always in institutions. The stories of how they got there were unclear. People didn't know they were there until later. Like, they were there for a decade, maybe, before they thought, oh, she was in an asylum all this time. And these were female relatives, and I found, obviously, that to be surprising. And it led me to really question, how does this happen? And they never got out. They died there. And it wasn't until I started researching and I realized that this is what happened. They did have, for example, one of them, the husband was having an affair, and the wife was in the way, put it that way, and so she ends up in an asylum, and I just couldn't understand that. And so I went and I researched it, and that was part of the eugenics movement. And when you were placed in an asylum as a woman, you could not get out unless a man took you under his care, or you could prove yourself competent. But many of these tests were written by wealthy educators who had an experience much beyond a farmer who had little resources, especially a girl who would not have had much formal education at that time. And so it really, those situations led me to explore, which is when I figured out, I'm like, oh, this was eugenics. That's what happened.
Jeez. I mean, I think I read somewhere, was it like a true crime book, that back then it was a lot easier for people to get rid of like throwaway children or ne'er-do-well children or inconvenient relatives or something like that. It was a lot easier to commit people, and that's what led to like a lot of reforms during the 60s and 70s. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's what I found as well. It was, and part of it was society. We didn't have the welfare systems that we have in place now for people who struggle. Now schools are in place where there's special education and there's resources for families, where then they didn't have those resources available. And so often, sometimes families were probably left with little to no choice. They couldn't care for them on their own. Okay. But then the other situation was people who were perfectly healthy also got wrapped up into that. And it became very easy, especially if you were not educated. But even, there's stories of very wealthy families who might have a child, as you said, a ne'er-do-well child who suddenly finds himself committed because they were maybe not towing the line at home.
Now, your novel also discusses sexual abuse. When you were doing your research, how did legal authorities deal with sexual abuse a century ago?
It was very rarely mentioned. It was often there was very little accountability. It was hardly mentioned, and there was really definitely no understanding of trauma and how that impacts survivors. But there was very little to. For example, I'll tell you this. One of the stories that inspired my the book was a little later, but there was stories of women who were attacked, which is similar to my story, and end up in asylums for being pregnant. They were seen as loose women. It didn't matter how they had got pregnant. No one really asked. And if they did, it was often seen as them garnering the attention of men, that they brought this on themselves. And so they're in a predicament where you speak out, and likely that's not going to help your situation anyway, because either people won't believe you, or the person who puts you in the situation has more power than you.
Sounds like Handmaid's Tale in some ways.
Yeah, it really does, yeah.
Yeah. Are there any autobiographical aspects in this novel?
No, fortunately, there's no autobiographical aspects, but I always say that when writing, it's a lot like reading, in that we put ourselves in other people's situations. So when we hear people say, write what you know, we don't mean you have to have experienced that specific event. Instead, you have to put yourself into that character's situation emotionally and decide how they feel and how they'd react. And I found this happening a lot in this story because of Anna's wilfulness. That definitely resonated with me, and I'm a pretty resilient person, and I think Anna has a lot of resilience herself. So I like to think she has some traits of mine.
Okay. Was any part of this novel based on any type of real events or persons that took place like a century ago? Anything that you stumbled across and basically translated into fiction?
Yeah, some of it. It isn't biographical based on one person in particular, but I took different stories from journals and interviews and created this story. The biggest influence was Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck, whose mother was in an asylum, lived with a foster family in Virginia. This is in the 1920s. She was attacked by her mother was in an asylum, so she's placed in a foster home. In that foster home, she's attacked by one of their relatives. They believe it was an uncle, and became pregnant. And in order to hide that, she's placed in the Virginia colony as a result of the pregnancy. She challenged the Virginia laws when the doctors required she be forced sterilized. She lost that court case, and in October of 1927, Carrie Buck was the first person in Virginia sterilized under the Virginia Eugenics Sterilization Act, which is solely based on eugenics. And the practice had been taking place for many years before that, but her court case solidified its legitimacy. And an interesting fun fact is years later, when she was a much older woman, she was released from the asylum, and they did test her with more modern methods. And she was not an imbecile, which, in quotes, that was the diagnosis that had led to her being forced sterilized. And they found that she was not. She actually had of average intelligence. So her story is similar to so many. I was really surprised in my research the number of women committed who had mothers who were also committed. That was actually a similar situation to the one I described. It was a mother and a daughter. And I thought that was an anomaly. And as I researched, it was not. It was actually quite common. And I would surmise from the research that it really had a lot to do with one male-dominated society and the mother's influence with raising daughters. And there's no mother figure, which makes the daughter more vulnerable to men, or to being forgotten, or to being pushed aside. And So it was interesting to see how much more common that was than I would have guessed.
I'm kind of curious. It just sparks a question in my mind. If there was a divorce in those days, would it be likely that the ex-wife and the daughter would be committed by the husband or something like that? Would you see something like that or no?
Yeah, well, often it wasn't necessarily divorce as much as they would commit them to end the marriage. And so they could live their single life, and you could commit the women. Men could commit women, and they could not get out unless a male took you back. So you're at the mercy of your husband. There's stories of women being committed, and the men would come visit them on occasion, and then be living totally separate lives and fabricate things that would make sure that they stay there.
Okay. Now, Jaime, please tell our listeners about your lovely short story, Fine is for Sugar.
Sure. Fine is for Sugar is a story that's really centered on Ray, who's a middle-aged man who's trying very desperately to bring some excitement to his life, but keeps falling short. The story is part of a larger collection of link stories that one other one is published. There's about 8 altogether. It's definitely a project that I like to go back to over the years. They all live in the same town, and the stories are linked in that they really, like Maureen in the story is his wife, and Kate is his other, the woman he's dating, and Kate has her own story. And so I wrote this series of short stories to really kind of show how we're a minor character in everyone else's story. And so while Ray has this story, when we see Kate's, we see a very different viewpoint. And essentially, Fine is for Sugar is a coming-of-age story, I'd say, for middle-aged people.
Okay. Now, Jaime, you teach college composition. When you're talking to your students, what is the most significant lesson you impart to them when it comes to creative writing?
I would say that writing is rewriting. It's a process, so don't give up on your story. Take time away from it to revisit it. Make sure that you have other people reading your work. You can't write in a bubble. You need feedback and an audience to really develop a story. And, just keep reworking it. Too often, I think, students stop before it's really finished. And until you write the end, you don't really know how that beginning should work. So you should always go back and go through it again with an open mind.
Okay. Let's talk about yourself now. Jaime, where were you born and raised?
I was raised in Drexel, New Jersey. I went to undergraduate at Rowan University for English and Psychology, and then University of Pennsylvania for graduate school in education. And then Drexel, I went to for my MFA in creative writing. So I'm very much the Philadelphia area, and I now live in Haddonfield, New Jersey. So I'm still right in the area.
Interesting. You studied psychology. I mean, how much did you apply? The lessons you learned, from college to Invisible Ones. Did that really help you when you were writing Invisible Ones? Your psychological studies.
It really did. And I still love to dabble. I still study psychology. I find it so fascinating, and I really did use a lot of that in this story. Same thing as Fine is for Sugar. A lot of my stories, I like to look at the psychology of the character and what drives them.
Who were when you were studying at Rowan? Who intrigued you most in terms of psychological theory and all that? Anyone in particular intrigue you?
I would say Carl Jung was probably my. I always found him fascinating in his theories.
Okay. Now, what led you to become a writer, Jaime?
I've always written. I mean, I used to, write really bad poetry in high school. That's how it started. And I have notebooks filled with writing. For me, it's always been an escape. just something I did. Even when my children were little, I would write novels just to kind of, get my mind going, because it was so challenging being home in the house with young kids all day, that I would create these stories. And not this one, I have a few in the drawer, but I really just always loved writing, and I've loved reading, and so I do think that that's just always been in me. I'm finally getting a time where I can dedicate a little more time to my writing, which is nice.
Okay. Did your parents, did they have literary backgrounds, your folks?
No, they did not. So I'm really the only writer in my family.
Okay. Jaime, whenever I interview an author, I always love to ask the standard question. When you were growing up, who were your favorite authors? And of those favorite authors, did any of them inspire you to become a writer, or perhaps influence your personal writing style?
Yeah, I feel like this is always a hard question because, it's always, I think there's just so many influences, I feel like, over the years. But I would say when I was very young, my favorite book was The Boxcar Children by Gertrude Chandler Warner. It's such a great story about children who are orphaned and live in a boxcar. And it does seem to be, I have some common themes in my writing. And also, I would say another big influence as I got a little older was V.C. Andrews, and which I wasn't old enough to be reading. I used to steal them off my mother's shelves and read them. Flowers in the Attic and Garden of Shadows were two of my favorites. And they were very dark. And I went on to later fall in love with the Bronte sisters, also dark. So I do say they had a big influence on me because I do tend to write stories that are dark and really explore humanity and people's psychology and what drives them. And so I think that, they were all pretty big influences on me. I could go on, but those are my major influences, I think.
Jaime, please tell our listeners, where can readers find your book, The Invisible Ones?
Sure, it's available at Inkwood Books in Haddonfield, Barnes & Noble in Philadelphia on Chestnut Street, and it's online at all major retailers, say Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Okay. What is your next book project, and when can we expect its release?
Well, I'm still in the works of drafting my next book, but I'll say it's a thriller. It's similar to the pacing of Invisible Ones, but it's not historical. But it does take place in the 90s, so if I don't get to finishing it soon, I'm afraid it's going to qualify as historical fiction again. So my goal is to really get back to that. But yeah, I expected my next book would probably be a thriller. That's what I tend to write. And even a lot of people have said The Invisible Ones people who are new to my work that said, it has a lot of thriller aspects for historical fiction, which it does. And I'm sure that worked its way in there naturally.
Well, I mean, if it's such a thrill, I'm curious like this. If Hollywood ever made a movie out of Invisible Ones, who would play Anna Wilson? Any idea? Any actress?
Let's see. I think you're not the first person to ask me that. But, Kristen Bell is who I think I would play her.
Okay.
Although she's getting older now, but she looks very young. I think she could pull it off.
Okay. So you always see yourself as writing fiction then?
I do. I enjoy writing. I like, because I teach, I do like instructional writing, and I have actually possibly working with a friend on something for more of a craft book for writing. But as for independent work, I see myself doing fiction.
Okay. Jaime, I want to thank you so much for appearing on the show. And when your next book comes out, please let me know. I want you on my show again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your having me. It was a pleasure to share my work and to talk books with you.
Thank you very much, and you take care, okay?
Thank you. You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show where I will be interviewing author Candace Havens. Thank you and good night.